Well, this is it. The British office versus the American office. I don't think there's ever been a larger argument when it comes to British versus American comedy. Both of these shows have a large dedicated fanbase that aren't exclusive to the country either version originated from. I've spoken to people who love the American version and people who love the British original. Unlike the in-betweeners, the American office managed to change itself and move away from the conventions of the original. Everything after season 2 is much different tonally and pretty much completely original, and it's one of the reasons that it ran for 9 whole seasons. Now, of course, the pilot episode remains pretty much a word-for-word adaptation, and trust me, we'll be taking a look at that later. But for now, let's explore the differences between the British office and the American office. First of all, British comedy has a significantly different tone to American comedy. Putting it bluntly, British comedy tends to be much more pessimistic and tragic in tone, whereas American comedy is generally lighter and more hopeful. This difference is evident with the two versions of The Office and can even be seen right away in the opening titles. The opening theme for the British office rolls in, painting a rather drab and depressing feeling to everything. This is complemented by cinematic shots of ugly grey buildings, traffic-filled roundabouts and road signs. There's a juxtaposition between the attractive camera work and the dreary, colourless scenery. It's a sombre opening that clues you into the kind of world you're about to enter. Compare that to the American opening. It's far more positive, from the music to the cinematography. You only need those first 3 notes of the theme to instantly let you know that you're watching something that is more light-hearted. The American opening is also far more Americanized. You have these shots of the main characters with the actors' names appearing over them, people smiling, the pace is much quicker and it's extremely similar to the other typical sitcom openings you see. Now this isn't a bad thing at all, it just highlights the overall difference between the two, and this is almost the first step to the American office carving out its own identity. Now, another key thing to look at would be cinematography. The documentary style of the British office was decided upon initially because it was far cheaper and easier to produce. Remember, at this time Ricky and Steve were pretty much nobodies, so the BBC weren't going to hand them a large chunk of money to make the show with. However, the British office used this to its advantage. It made sure to always stick to the documentary format with mostly single camera shots, bleak realistic lighting, and by avoiding filming any scenes or cuts that were too improbable for a cheap documentary. This slow and dull style of the cinematography helped shape the overall tone of the series. Working in an office is mundane and depressing, and they show that perfectly. The American version started out looking a lot more like the British show. They even styled Michael Scott's hair to look like he was kind of balding and sleazy. But by the time season 2 rolled around, the cinematography had changed. The image was much brighter and more colourful, almost representative of the tonal shift that the series had. I also noticed that there tend to be far more cuts and edits within the American office, as well as more camera angles. The handheld documentary style is kept, but the overall focus on it is significantly reduced to the point of it being basically unbelievable. If you told someone that the British office was a real documentary, then the chances are that they would believe you, but I doubt anyone would be convinced by the American office. The layout and lighting of some scenes look so much like they're part of a regular sitcom. Once again, this isn't really a flaw with the American office, since the shooting style complements the type of humour they're trying to deliver. It's fast and often sharp, so the heavy cutting in some scenes is justified. Now, a big area for comparison is obviously the humour, and both shows almost perfectly sum up the styles of comedy that their respective country is known for. I think Stephen Fry makes a fantastic analysis of both countries' comedic styles, as well as the origins of these styles.
If you go to an American bookshop, by far the biggest section is self-help and improvement. The idea that life is refinable and improvable. Comedy is the microcosm that allows us to examine the entire difference between our two cultures. Ours is bathed in failure, but we make a glory of our failure. We celebrate it.
One thing noticeable about the British office is how much quieter it is. It's rare that a joke or funny moment is presented on a plate for you to enjoy. It's often far more subtle or requires you to put yourself in the situation. If you walk into the British office expecting a flat-out comedy, then you're likely going to be disappointed. Any comedy within the series tends to be weaved into several layers of character and story, and more often than not, it's part of something awkward or cringe-inducing. When you look into Ricky and Steve's comments on making the show, you can really see how much care and attention was put into it. They wanted to make sure they made something that was realistic and grounded. The British office has its wacky moments, but it's never to the point of being unrealistic. By contrast, the American office is far less serious in tone. It embraces its wacky moments and goes far further with its jokes than would ever be realistic. The characters are all larger than life and hilariously eccentric. When showing either version to an average viewer, especially a younger one, it's likely that the American office will succeed in making them laugh more frequently. It's managed to make me laugh several times, but for different reasons than the British one. There's a scene in which Dwight is being taught how to show he's listening to other people.
A little smile and a nod shows that I hear you.
But Dwight, being the person he is, takes it way too far and the outcome is hilarious.
Children of the world coming together, cutting down trees to make paper, but not in a child laboury way.
It's just up and down.
However, it would probably feel out of place in the UK version since, whilst various characters are inept, they're inept in much more realistic and subtle ways than Dwight. If anything, The American Office is the sitcom Ricky and Steve never wanted to make. There's a scene from the unaired test pilot in which Gareth is trying to speak to David after hearing about the redundancies in the office. However, people keep entering the room after also hearing the news and ruin what Gareth hoped would be a private meeting.
As team leader, oh, this is pathetic. Right, I called this meeting. Thanks for coming.
I personally thought this scene was quite funny, but for Ricky and Steve, it was a step too far.
When we look back at the pilot, it just felt a bit too much like it had become a sitcom with a beginning, middle, and an end.
I was genuinely panicked, wasn't I? Because I thought it was the sitcom that we always said we wouldn't make.
They wanted to keep every scenario grounded enough for it to be realistic, and on top of that, respect the idea of it being a documentary. It's not a bad thing that the American version is outlandish, it just shows the clear different visions and goals that each version had.
You were in the parking lot earlier, that's how I know you.
Okay, here's a big comparison to be made. David Brent versus Michael Scott. David, for me, is one of the ultimate comedic tragedies. With David, you have a man who thinks he's the life and soul of the party. To him, his comedy is the best, his impressions are the best, he's everyone's friend, but in reality, he has pretty much none of that. David wants to please everyone and manages to please absolutely no one. He wants to be best mates with all of the workers in the office, but only manages to create an awkward disconnect between him and his colleagues. He also fancies himself as a bit of a blue-collar working man, but is so clearly rejected from their circle.
Taffy! Taffy! Glyn!
What?
Real grim Taffy.
He likes to appeal to the higher-ups, but gets the whole business world stamping on him for his actions. David also spends a lot of time trying to show how caring and aware he is by pointing out things that are racist or sexist, or even making comments that he believes will prove he is without prejudice.
Does my bum look big in these? It's not sexist, that's the bloke saying it. At last. So.
Ironically, these actions nearly always expose some sort of ignorance or preconception within him.
If I had my way, the place would be full of them.
And if anyone ever appears to be in a better position to David, he will nearly always try and find some way to undermine their success. David is ultimately a complete arse, but he's not unlikable. He steps over the line frequently, and yet there are just enough scenes that are able to redeem him. A scene I particularly enjoy is when he's working through the employee survey with Keith, and at this one moment in time, he's not joking around, he's not trying to make anyone laugh, nor is he playing up to the camera. He's simply doing his job, and it's unbelievably refreshing.
Under weaknesses, you've put eczema.
Another moment that displays this for me is when David plays his guitar during the staff training episode. You see, it would have been really easy to make David terrible at playing guitar in order to conjure up the same sort of awkward comedy as when he danced, but instead they made him actually quite good.
Spaceman came down to answer some things. The world gathered round from paupers to kings.
He's not amazing or anything, but he's surprisingly competent. Not only that, but the moment cheers up Dawn and entertains everyone during what would have been a very boring training seminar. This moment shows that David's not a completely incompetent buffoon at all, and even makes me a little sad for him. David has a genuine skill, and yet here he is cooped up as a manager for a paper merchant. Whilst David would have you believe that he has many skills in things such as comedy or dancing, it's clear that he doesn't. But here is one thing that he is somewhat good at, and it's mostly buried as part of his past. It makes you think that if David dropped his act, picked up his guitar and had a really good go, he might be able to turn his life around.
Logical, think. Progression.
There's no logic to music, it's art.
But ultimately his flawed character and image of himself won't allow that. When I cringe at David Brent, I also cringe for him. You want him to do well in a situation because in the end, he's not really a bad person. A truly bad person does exist, but we'll touch on them later. Now with Michael Scott, I have a very different reaction. Michael to me comes across as someone who's living entirely inside his own head. Whilst David seems somewhat grounded, Michael comes across as blissfully ignorant and almost socially incompetent. He's a much more extreme and ludicrous character than David, and I believe that is what makes him easier to watch. My sister, who has watched far more of The American Office than me, said this about Michael. Michael's character is so over the top and ridiculous that watching him is no longer painful. Instead, it's just entertaining. With David Brent, he's almost too realistic, and it makes every interaction far more painful and awkward. David feels like some of the people I know, whereas Michael is too absurd for that. I think the general consensus is that Michael is more likeable. He has more redeemable moments than Brent, and also manages to maintain a sort of childlike innocence. In many ways, he's like a sort of Homer Simpson. He might seem ignorant or mean-spirited at times, but really he's just doing what he thinks is right. Michael is a guy just trying to fit in. He's been put in a very boring and mundane environment that doesn't really connect well with him. He's an excitable person with a very unexciting life, so whenever he sees an opportunity to have fun, then he will take it. In the end, he wants to have his own group of friends and for people to actually want him. Often though, he doesn't know how to get the things he wants and tends to bumble his way through situations. It's clear that he cares about the people he works with, he's just not too clued in on the actual feelings of those around him. However, one big character I can comment on is Chris Finch and his American equivalent Todd Packer. I feel like Finch's addition to the original series was to show exactly how unlikable someone could be.
Give me half hour there, it'll be up to me nuts and guts.
It gave a viewer a perspective for David and allowed you to see just how small he was next to Finch. In many scenes, Brent seemed like just a tag-along, whereas Finch is stealing the show. On top of that, I get a sense of fear from David as I watch him in these scenes, and I'm certain this was intentional. David seems to both admire Finch and be intimidated by him. He wants to be part of Finch's gang and spend time hanging out with him, but feels overpowered by him. It's one of the occasions where you feel sort of sorry for David as you see the kind of treatment he receives from Finch.
He's one of those people that when he walks into the room, he does say funny things, and you laugh, and then you go, it's my turn soon.
When this is compared with Michael and Todd Packer, I don't get the same effect. Michael seems far too enamored with Todd to the point of idiocy.
One time we were out and we met this set of twins. One thing led to another, and we brought them back to the motel. And then Packer did both of them. It was awesome. It was
It's still funny in a tragic sort of way, and the joke is ultimately on Michael being the loser. There's a chance that the character was used differently since Michael didn't really need someone to make him appear more likeable. His childlike personality did that for him. However, I believe that it's a very crucial part to the original, and it makes this final scene in the Christmas special all the more powerful.
No dog with you today, David?
Oh, do you not see her? She just left.
Chris,
yeah.
Why don't you fuck off?
This scene is brilliant for so many reasons. First of all, in the few seconds leading up to it, you see David cracking jokes, looking into the camera and trying to play it up like he usually does. However, after Chris makes a dig at his date, Brent stops the act, looks Finch dead in the eyes and tells him,
Chris,
yeah.
Why don't you fuck off?
Then gives a look to Neil as if to say, you too, and leaves the frame without looking at the camera once. It's unbelievably satisfying and is another moment that shows the more grounded and human side to David. I think both bosses do well in their respective series, but when it comes to the British Office, I found that there's just so much more to explore in David's character. People can be quick to say he has zero redeemable features, but I argue that that's not true. They're there, you just have to look harder for them. I'd love to look into more characters, talking about what makes them work, what makes them realistic, or what makes them funny. However, I'm going to save that for another time. Finally though, it's time for a good old head-to-head comparison. This time, it's the stapler scene. Now, there are a few areas in the scene in which I feel some of the humour was lost in the adaptation. Ignoring some minor nitpicks, my first point would be David Brent's delivery of this line.
Eat it out, there's people starving in the world, which I hate.
Notice how David is always trying to stay within the eye line of the camera. He's constantly playing up to it and trying to paint himself in the best light possible. He thinks that by delivering this line he's showing the world how aware and thoughtful he is, and part of the humour comes from the completely obvious act he puts on. In the American one, Michael seems to treat the camera as an afterthought. He's more concerned with what's going on in front of him and only just seems to remember he's being filmed.
because there are starving people in the world, and which I hate, and it is a waste.
I'd say that this is more fitting for Michael's personality later in the series, however here it just doesn't connect well with the British writing and misses the entire point of the line. Another change that creates a problem is changing Jim's jelly cubes to Jim's Jello pot. And that is the weirdest line I've had to say today. The comedy from this original moment comes from Tim asking,
"How do you know it was me?"
whilst intentionally eating the jelly cubes in front of Gareth, making it obvious that Tim was the culprit. With Jim, the jelly is not only a different colour, but it's a form that can't even be used to make the same jelly that Dwight Stapler is in. From doing my research, it seems that jelly cubes aren't actually a thing in America, which surprised me, so I guess they had to do their best to adapt the joke. Unfortunately though, this results in much of the humour being lost from the situation. The final change I'll comment upon is this one here.
Can you discipline him?
Oh, kinky!
No. Are you going to discipline him or not?
Ooh, discipline. Kinky. Alright.
I believe that the UK version handles the awkwardness of this scene far better. After David's inappropriate comment, he's left to stare awkwardly from Ricky to Gareth as nobody laughs. We get to see David flounder in the failure of his own joke until he gives up and moves the conversation forward. In the American version, they cut away to a reactionary shot, and this removes much of the awkward tension. It's a much more obvious way of showing that an inappropriate comment was made when compared to the lack of reaction in the British version. On top of that, the moment moves by much faster, and the audience isn't forced to suffer through the pain of the joke falling falling flat. However, one thing we can be thankful for is that the producers did notice these issues and started moving the show in its own direction, and because of this we now have two iconic shows to enjoy. When it comes down to it, each show provides us with a very different tone. One is dry, realistic and sometimes hopeless, whereas the other one is cheerful, cartoony and friendly. You'd almost want to work at Dunder Mifflin since it feels so colourful and fun at times. The American Office seem to recognise that work is an area in which you waste your life away, and people don't want to be reminded of that in their entertainment, so as a result the show has a more positive and inviting world. The British version makes you feel like you're working at Wernham Hogg, slogging through the mundane and boring office life. It's designed to be relatable and true to life for people that have worked in offices in the past. With every ray of sunshine there's 1,000 things that can go wrong. It can be hard to watch even for those who are used to the British style of cringe comedy. Neither is necessarily better than the other, since they're both trying to achieve different things, so whether you stick with the original or tune into the American, you're always assured some quality entertainment. Wait, it's been the entire video and I haven't even stuck in a reference to Jennifer Connelly. Hey, thanks for watching this and putting up with my lack of content. There's every chance that the BBC will claim this video like they did with my Blackadder one and won't let up, so yeah, I could be in some crap with this one. I don't know what I'm even saying here. Subscribe if you haven't already. The end. The bye. Bye-bye.